Something really strange happened to me a few years ago, and to this day, I still have no idea what this woman actually wanted. It started pretty normally. One afternoon, I was scrolling through social media when I noticed I had a new friend request. It was from a woman I didn't recognize. Normally, I probably would have ignored it, but I noticed we had one mutual friend. He wasn't someone I was particularly close with, but we had gone to school together and still lived in roughly the same area. Because of that, I assumed the request was harmless. So I accepted it without thinking much about it. I didn't check her profile or look into who she was. A few hours later, I got a message from her, just a simple hello. I replied, and we started chatting. The conversation was casual, nothing unusual. Mostly basic questions, small talk, and getting to know each other. She told me very little about herself, just that she was around my age and worked in a nearby city. She seemed friendly enough. Later that evening, though, something happened that completely changed how I viewed the situation. A few hours after our conversation, I happened to glance out the front window of my house. There was a car parked across the street. That alone wasn't necessarily strange, but something about it caught my attention. There was a woman sitting in the driver's seat, and from what I could tell, she looked almost exactly like the woman I'd just been messaging. At first, I thought I had to be imagining it, but the more I looked, the more certain I became. It really looked like her. That immediately made me uncomfortable. I stepped away from the window so she wouldn't notice me looking. My mind immediately started trying to explain it. Maybe she lived nearby. Maybe she was visiting someone on my street. Maybe it was all just a coincidence, but something about it didn't feel right. After a while, I checked the window again. She was still there. At one point, I even considered messaging her to ask about it, but I decided against it. Eventually, I checked again, and the car was gone. For the rest of that night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The whole thing was unsettling enough that I decided to stop replying to her messages. The next day, she messaged me again. At first, it was casual, just asking how I was doing. I ignored it for a while, but after multiple messages, I finally replied. During the conversation, I asked which city she lived in. She named a city near mine, but not the same one, so that ruled out the possibility of her being one of my neighbors. That honestly made things feel even weirder. I continued the conversation briefly. Then she asked if I wanted to meet up. She suggested a specific day and time. I told her I was busy. Her attitude changed almost immediately. She became irritated and noticeably rude. She kept pushing the idea of meeting in person and seemed annoyed that I turned her down. That was when I finally confronted her. I told her I had seen someone who looked exactly like her parked outside my house the night before. She denied it instantly. At that point, I was done. The entire situation felt far too strange, so I blocked her. Honestly, I felt relieved after doing it. But one thought still bothered me. She seemed to know where I lived, and unfortunately, that concern turned out to be justified. That same evening, she showed up. This time, she came directly to my house. I was in the kitchen when I suddenly heard knocking at the front door. It was around 8 p.m. I walked over and looked outside. It was her. The second I saw her, I stepped away from the door. Then she knocked again, harder this time. A moment later, she started shouting through the door, saying she knew I was home. Then she demanded that I let her inside. That was enough for me. Without opening the door, I shouted back that I was calling the police if she didn't leave. She ignored me. She stayed there, still knocking occasionally, still refusing to leave. When it became obvious she wasn't going anywhere, I actually called the police. I stayed near the front of the house while waiting. She remained outside the entire time. About 15 minutes later, officers arrived. I could hear her arguing with them from outside. Eventually, they got her to leave. They warned her not to return to my property again, or she would be arrested. Thankfully, after that night, I never saw her again. Later, I even contacted our mutual friend to ask who she was. His answer made the situation even stranger. He told me he barely knew her himself and had no idea why they were connected online. So in the end, I never got any real explanation. I still don't know how she found me, or why she became so fixated on meeting me. But I'm just glad she eventually left me alone. This happened to me last summer, and honestly, I still think about how differently that night could have ended. At the time, I was living alone in a fairly ordinary apartment inside a large apartment complex. Nothing unusual about it at all. It was a one-bedroom flat with a small kitchen, living room, bathroom, and a short hallway leading to the front door. I had been living there for a while and was very used to my routine. One night, I ended up working much later than usual. By the time I finally got home, I was completely exhausted. I took a quick shower, got changed, and went straight to bed. I remember checking the time before falling asleep. It was around midnight. Everything about that night felt normal. But at around 4 a.m., I woke up suddenly. Not because of a noise or anything unusual. I was just wide awake. It happens to me sometimes during summer. I wake up feeling extremely thirsty and dehydrated, especially after long days when I haven't had enough water. That night was one of those nights. So I got out of bed, walked to the kitchen, and poured myself a glass of water. After drinking it, I felt much better physically, but unfortunately, I was still completely awake. I knew from experience that I probably wouldn't be falling back asleep anytime soon. Whenever that happened, I usually just sat in the living room and watched television until I felt tired again. Usually 20 or 30 minutes was enough, so that's exactly what I did. I walked into the living room, sat down on the sofa, and switched on the TV. My sofa was positioned to the right of the front door, maybe 6 meters away. As I sat down, I happened to glance over toward the entrance. That's when I noticed something strange. My front door wasn't fully locked. I could tell immediately. The deadbolt hadn't been turned. For a second, I just stared at it. I always lock my door before bed, always. Apparently, after getting home so late and being so tired, I had somehow forgotten. That realization made me uncomfortable. So I got up immediately, walked over, and locked it properly. Deadbolt and handle. Then I went back to the sofa and continued watching TV. A few minutes passed, maybe 5. Nothing unusual. I was flipping through channels, half paying attention, waiting to feel sleepy again. Then I heard it. A sound that instantly got my attention. The sound of someone trying to open my front door. The handle moved. Very slightly, but enough for me to hear it. At first, I genuinely thought I imagined it. But then I heard it again, a soft rattling sound. Someone was definitely testing the handle. My heart started racing immediately. It was 4 a.m. Nobody should have been at my door. I muted the television and sat completely still, listening. Silence. No footsteps. No voices. Nothing. After a few seconds, curiosity got the better of me. I stood up quietly and walked toward the door. I looked through the peephole first. Nobody. The hallway looked completely empty. That honestly made it even creepier. For a moment, I wondered if whoever had tried the handle had already left. Against my better judgment, I slowly unlocked the door and opened it. I leaned slightly into the hallway. That's when I saw him. A man in a dark hooded sweatshirt was walking away from my apartment. He was several meters down the corridor, moving casually as if nothing was wrong. His hood was up and his head was lowered. I couldn't see his face clearly. At first, I just watched him, confused. Then I saw something that immediately made my stomach drop. He stopped at another apartment door, reached for the handle, and tried opening it. Locked. He moved to the next door, tried that one too, locked again. That's when I realized exactly what was happening. This man was literally walking through the hallway, trying random apartment doors to see if anyone had forgotten to lock them, including mine. And if I hadn't woken up earlier and noticed my unlocked door, he probably would have gotten inside. That thought hit me all at once. I stood there frozen, just watching him. He kept moving farther down the hall, checking one door after another. Then, right before reaching the corner at the end of the corridor, he suddenly stopped. Slowly, he turned his head and looked directly at me. He had finally noticed that I was standing there. The second our eyes met, I felt pure panic. I immediately stepped back inside and slammed the door shut, then locked it again. Every lock. I stood there in silence, just staring at the door, expecting him to come back. But he never did. No knocking, no footsteps, nothing. Eventually, after several minutes, I checked through the peephole again. The hallway was empty. He was gone. I barely slept at all after that. I stayed awake until sunrise, replaying the entire thing in my head. The scariest part wasn't even seeing him, it was realities. Something strange happened to me a few months ago, and I still don't know what the person's real intention was. I live with my wife in a fairly normal house in a quiet neighborhood. Nothing unusual ever really happens here, which is probably why this whole situation felt even more unsettling. One night, we had both gone to bed at a normal time and were fast asleep when I suddenly woke up to the sound of knocking. At first, I was half asleep and confused, but after hearing it again, I realized someone was knocking on our front door. I checked the time on my phone. It was almost 2 a.m. That immediately felt wrong. Nobody comes to your house at that time unless something is seriously wrong. The knocking woke my wife up too. She asked what was going on, and I told her I was going to check. I got out of bed and walked carefully toward the front entrance. Before opening anything, I looked outside through the small window beside the door. Standing on the porch was a man I had never seen before. He looked pretty normal. Nothing about him stood out. Just an ordinary-looking guy standing at my front door in the middle of the night. Looking back, opening the door probably wasn't the smartest decision, but at the time I was mostly confused. So I unlocked the door and opened it just enough to talk to him. I immediately asked who he was and why he was at my house at 2 a.m. The guy answered in a calm voice and said he was there because of an online listing. That confused me even more. He claimed he had come to buy a television. The problem was, I wasn't selling a television. In fact, I hadn't listed anything online at all. I told him he clearly had the wrong address. That's when the conversation got even stranger. The man asked me, "Are you Randy?" That immediately made me uncomfortable, because that is actually my name. At that point, I started feeling genuinely uneasy. I asked how he knew that. He pulled out his phone and showed me a conversation. Someone had apparently been messaging him, arranging a late-night meetup to sell a TV. The messages included my full address, not just a nearby house, my exact address. One of the messages even specifically told him to come at around 2 a.m. That part made absolutely no sense. Who arranges to sell something to a stranger in the middle of the night? I told him very clearly that whoever he had been messaging was not me. I explained that I wasn't selling anything and had no idea who was behind it. For a moment, he just stood there looking confused. Then things got even more uncomfortable. He asked if he could come inside anyway. That immediately set off alarm bells in my head. I told him no, very firmly. I said he needed to leave and figure out who had been messaging him, because it definitely wasn't me. Then I closed the door and locked it immediately, every lock. After that, I stayed by the window for a minute, watching to make sure he actually left. Thankfully, he eventually walked away and left the property. Once I was sure he was gone, I went back to the bedroom and told my wife everything. She was just as confused as I was. Neither of us could come up with a reasonable explanation. Maybe someone was pretending to be me for some weird prank, or maybe the messages were fake from the beginning. Honestly, the whole thing felt suspicious. Part of me still thinks the guy may have created the conversation himself as an excuse to get me to open the door. Maybe he wanted to see if I was naive enough to let him inside. I really don't know. Nothing else ever happened after that night. But ever since then, if someone knocks on my door late at night. A few weeks ago, I decided to sell an old sofa that had been sitting in my spare room for months. It was worn out, took up too much space, and I had already replaced it with a newer one. At first, I considered just giving it away, but I figured I might as well try to make a little money from it first. I live alone in a small 2-bedroom house, about 20 minutes outside a large city. So I listed the sofa online for $75, or best offer. For over a week, nothing happened. I got one message asking if it was still available, but the person never followed through. Eventually, I lowered the price to $50. Even then, there was still no interest. I was honestly close to marking it as free just to get rid of it. Then one afternoon, I finally got another message. Someone asked if the sofa was still available. I told them yes, and they replied almost immediately saying they wanted to come by and buy it. The buyer introduced herself as Gabby. We agreed on a time for the following day. Everything about the conversation seemed normal, nothing unusual at all. The next day, Gabby arrived exactly when she said she would. She pulled up outside in a truck, and I let her into the house to look at the sofa. After seeing it in person, she offered me $20 instead. Obviously, that was much lower than I had asked for, but honestly, by that point, I was just happy someone was willing to take it, so I agreed. I helped her carry the sofa outside and load it into the back of the truck. Once it was secured, she thanked me, got into her vehicle, and drove away. That was it. A completely normal transaction, or so I thought. Later that night, I went to bed feeling pretty satisfied that I had finally gotten rid of the thing. Everything was normal, until just after midnight. I woke up suddenly to a loud noise. At first, I was disoriented and confused. Then I heard it again. A violent banging sound. For a split second, I thought someone was trying to break in. Then I realized the noise was coming from my front door. Someone was pounding on it, hard. Not knocking, actually pounding, loud enough to echo through the house. Then I heard something else, another banging noise. This one sounded like it was coming from one of the side windows. That was the moment I realized there might be more than one person outside. It genuinely sounded like multiple people were around my house. One at the front door, possibly another at a window, maybe more. I was too terrified to check. I didn't even go near the bedroom door. Instead, I grabbed my phone immediately and called emergency services. While on the phone, I stayed in bed, completely frozen. The banging continued, constantly, for what felt like forever. Realistically, it was probably around 5 minutes. But when you're lying in bed convinced someone is trying to get inside your house, 5 minutes feels much longer. Then, as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. Complete silence. No footsteps, no voices, nothing. That silence was somehow even worse. I had no idea if the people were still outside, if they had left, or if they had somehow already gotten inside. So I stayed exactly where I was and waited for the police to arrive. Eventually, officers got there and searched around the property. By then, whoever had been outside was already gone. No cars, no people, nothing. I explained everything I could, but unfortunately, I hadn't actually seen anyone. I didn't know how many people had been outside or what they looked like. There wasn't much the police could do beyond documenting the incident and telling me to call again if anything happened. Thankfully, nobody ever came back, but I still think about how strange the timing was. Nothing like that had ever happened to me before. Then the same day, a stranger comes to my house to buy furniture. Multiple people show up after midnight pounding on my doors and windows. Maybe it was unrelated. Maybe it was just a bizarre coincidence. I honestly have no proof otherwise, but I can't help feeling those two things were somehow connected. And whatever the reason was, I'm just glad nothing worse happened that night.